At the beginning of the Second World War, Germany believed it understood how the air war over Europe would unfold. Military planners expected that enemy bombers would attack during daylight hours, when crews could navigate accurately and identify industrial targets more easily. Because of this expectation, the German air defense system was built primarily to counter large bomber formations flying in daylight. Radar stations, anti-aircraft artillery batteries, and fighter interception units were organized around the idea that enemy bombers would be visible in the sky and could be tracked as they approached major cities. Across Germany, an extensive defensive network began to take shape. Radar installations were positioned along the coastline and deeper inland to detect approaching aircraft. Though these radar stations could observe enemy formations crossing the North Sea or flying over occupied Europe, giving defenders time to prepare for interception. Once radar detected incoming bombers, information was passed quickly to fighter squadrons and air defense command centers responsible for protecting key industrial regions. At the same time, large numbers of anti-aircraft guns were deployed around major cities and factories. These guns, known as flak batteries, formed protective rings around industrial centers such as Hamburg, Berlin, and the Ruhr Valley. Their purpose was to create dangerous defensive zones that enemy bombers would have to fly through if they attempted to attack German targets. When bomber formations entered these zones during daylight, hundreds of shells could be fired into the sky, forcing bombers to fly through clouds of explosive fragments. Fighter aircraft played an equally important role in this defensive system. German fighter squadrons were trained to intercept bomber formations once radar stations detected them approaching. These fighters would climb quickly and position themselves above the incoming bombers before launching attacks designed to disrupt the formation and force bombers to release their payloads early or turn back entirely. Coordinated fighter interception was expected to weaken bombing raids before they could reach their intended targets. Together, radar detection, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter interception formed a layered defense designed to stop bombing raids before they could cause major damage. With the entire system assumed that enemy bombers would appear in daylight skies, where defenders could track them, intercept them, and engage them directly. For a time, this defensive structure appeared logical. Aircraft were easier to navigate during the day, and early bombing doctrine in many air forces favored daylight operations. German planners therefore focused their resources on building defenses capable of fighting visible bomber formations approaching their cities from across Europe. But the air war over Germany would not unfold exactly the way those planners expected. As the war expanded across Europe, Allied air forces began testing bombing operations against German targets. Industrial centers, rail networks, and military factories were all considered valuable objectives. Destroying these facilities could weaken Germany's ability to produce weapons and supply its armies. However, early bombing missions quickly revealed how dangerous daylight attacks could become when facing an organized air defense system. Flying in daylight allowed bomber crews to navigate more accurately and identify their targets clearly. Cities, factories, and rail yards were easier to locate when the ground below was visible. But the same daylight that helped bomber crews also made them easier to detect. German radar stations could identify incoming aircraft at long distances, and once the bombers approached defended regions, they became visible to anti-aircraft gunners and fighter pilots waiting to intercept them. As bomber formations approached German airspace, fighter squadrons were often already climbing to meet them. German interceptor aircraft attempted to position themselves above or alongside the bomber formations before launching attacks. Their goal was to break the bomber formations apart and force aircraft to leave the protective defensive patterns that bomber crews relied upon for survival. Once separated, individual bombers became much easier targets. Anti-aircraft defenses added another layer of danger. As bomber formations approached industrial cities, they entered regions heavily protected by flak batteries. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns could fire shells into the sky, creating dense patterns of explosions designed to damage aircraft flying through them. Even when bombers were not destroyed directly, these explosions could damage engines, fuel systems, or control surfaces, making the return journey extremely difficult. Daylight conditions also made it easier for defenders to track bomber formations once they were detected. Fighter pilots could visually locate bombers in the sky and pursue them across large distances. Because bombers typically flew in tight formations for defensive protection, they created large and visible targets against the background of the sky. Interceptor pilots could approach these formations repeatedly, launching attacks before pulling away and repositioning for another pass. These dangers forced bomber crews to maintain strict formation discipline while under attack. Flying in formation allowed defensive gunners aboard the bombers to support each other, but it also limited how quickly the formation could maneuver. When flak bursts appeared ahead or fighters approached from multiple directions, bomber crews had little room to evade without disrupting the formation. As a result, daylight bombing missions often came with heavy losses. Aircraft damaged by fighters or anti-aircraft fire struggled to stay with the formation, and damaged bombers attempting to return home sometimes failed to make the journey. The experience of these missions began raising serious questions among Allied commanders about whether large bombing operations could continue safely during daylight hours against such defenses. It was becoming clear that attacking heavily defended cities in daylight carried serious risks. As Allied air forces evaluated the results of early bombing missions, a difficult reality became increasingly clear. Attacking heavily defended German cities during daylight exposed bomber formations to intense fighter interception and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Even when bombers managed to reach their targets, the journey through defended airspace often resulted in significant aircraft losses. These risks forced military planners to reconsider how bombing operations should be conducted against a well-organized air defense system. British Air Command began examining alternatives that could reduce the exposure of bomber crews to German defenses. One idea gradually gained attention: conducting bombing operations during the night instead of daylight. At first, this concept presented serious challenges. Navigating across large distances in darkness was far more difficult than flying during the day. Bomber crews would have to locate cities and industrial targets without the clear visual references that daylight provided. Despite these difficulties, nighttime operations offered one important advantage. Darkness made it much harder for defending fighter aircraft to visually locate bomber formations. During daylight, bombers could often be seen from miles away against the bright sky. At night, however, aircraft flying at high altitude were much harder to detect unless searchlights or radar guidance brought interceptors directly to them. This shift in thinking gradually changed how the Royal Air Force approached its bombing campaign. Instead of focusing on daylight precision raids against individual factories, the British planners began organizing large bomber formations designed to strike targets under the cover of darkness. The goal was not only to reach German cities, but also to reduce the effectiveness of the defensive systems waiting for them. Night operations created new tactical conditions. German radar could still detect incoming aircraft, but locating individual bombers in the darkness was far more complicated for fighter pilots attempting to intercept them. Searchlights could illuminate aircraft temporarily, but coordinating those lights with fighter interceptions proved difficult in many cases. For bomber crews, flying at night also introduced different challenges. Navigation required careful planning, and locating targets in darkness demanded new techniques. Crews had to rely on instruments, radio navigation systems, and visual markers to guide them toward their objectives. These methods were still developing, and early night raids often struggled with accuracy. Even with these difficulties, night bombing offered a promising alternative to the heavy losses experienced during daylight missions. If bombers could reach German airspace under cover of darkness, they might be able to avoid the most dangerous parts of the defensive network designed specifically for daytime interception. Gradually, the air war over Germany began shifting toward a new kind of battlefield, One fought largely in the darkness of night. As bombing operations increasingly shifted to nighttime, the nature of the air war over Germany began to change in ways that defenders had not originally anticipated. German air defenses had been organized around the expectation of daylight attacks, where bomber formations could be tracked visually and intercepted by fighter aircraft guided toward them. But when bombers began crossing German airspace, under the cover of darkness, many of the advantages that daylight defenders relied upon were reduced. One of the most immediate effects of night bombing was the difficulty of visual detection. During daylight, aircraft could often be spotted at long distances against the sky. At night, however, bomber formations flying at high altitude were almost invisible unless they passed directly through illuminated areas or were detected by radar. The fighter pilots attempting to intercept bombers in darkness could no longer rely on simply seeing their targets in the sky. Searchlights became one of the primary tools used to locate enemy aircraft at night. When radar stations detected incoming bombers, searchlight crews attempted to sweep the sky with powerful beams of light, hoping to catch aircraft in the open. If a bomber was illuminated by a searchlight, anti-aircraft gunners could fire at the target and night fighters might be directed toward it. However, successfully holding an aircraft in a searchlight beam was often difficult, especially when large bomber formations were moving quickly across defended areas. Night conditions also made it harder for fighter pilots to intercept bombers effectively. In daylight, a fighter aircraft could approach bomber formations using visual cues and maneuver freely to attack from different angles. At night, locating bombers often required radar guidance or coordination with ground-based control systems. Even when fighters were guided toward incoming aircraft, actually finding the bombers in the darkness remained challenging. For bomber crews, flying at night offered greater protection from these defenses. Aircraft flying in darkness were less likely to be intercepted by fighters unless the defenders had precise radar tracking or successful searchlight illumination. As a result, bomber formations could often reach their target areas with fewer direct engagements compared to daylight missions. However, night bombing also introduced new operational challenges for the attacking forces. Navigating long distances in darkness required accurate instruments and careful coordination among bomber crews. Locating the correct target city within Germany could be difficult when ground features were not clearly visible. These navigation problems sometimes caused bombing raids to scatter across wide areas, reducing the effectiveness of individual attacks. Even so, the shift to night operations gradually forced Germany to confront a new kind of aerial threat. The skies above German cities were no longer dominated by daylight interception battles. Instead, bombers were now approaching under conditions that made traditional defenses far less reliable. The air war over Germany had entered a different phase. As night bombing operations increased, German air defenses faced a growing challenge that had not been fully anticipated during the early planning of the war. The defensive system built to protect German cities was still powerful, but much of it had been designed with daylight combat in mind. Radar stations, anti-aircraft guns, and interceptor fighters were all effective when enemy aircraft could be tracked visually and engaged in open skies. Night raids, however, forced defenders to operate under completely different conditions. One of the biggest difficulties was locating bomber formations once they entered German airspace. Radar systems could detect incoming aircraft at long distances, but radar alone did not always provide precise visual guidance for intercepting fighters. Ground controllers could estimate the position and direction of the bombers, but directing a fighter pilot toward an aircraft flying in darkness required extremely accurate coordination. Searchlights were intended to solve part of this problem. These powerful beams were positioned around key cities and industrial regions. When radar detected incoming bombers, searchlight crews attempted to illuminate the sky where the aircraft were expected to appear. If a bomber was caught in the beam, it could briefly become visible to anti-aircraft gunners and interceptor pilots. In theory, this combination of radar detection and searchlight tracking would allow German defenses to locate bombers even at night. In practice, however, this system was far from perfect. Bomber formations could approach from multiple directions, and their altitude often made searchlight targeting difficult. Aircraft flying above cloud layers or moving quickly through the defended areas could pass through searchlight zones before defenders had enough time to coordinate a response. Even when bombers were briefly illuminated, the moment might last only seconds before the aircraft disappeared back into darkness. Anti-aircraft guns continued to fire against suspected bomber routes, but night conditions made accurate targeting more difficult. Flak batteries often relied on radar estimates rather than clear visual tracking, which reduced the precision of their fire. While these guns still posed a threat to bomber crews, the difficulty of seeing targets directly in the sky meant that many aircraft passed through defended regions without being engaged as effectively as they might have been during daylight. German fighter pilots also faced new challenges. Intercepting bombers in darkness required specialized training and coordination with radar operators on the ground. Fighter aircraft needed guidance to reach the approximate location of the bombers, and once in that area, pilots still had to locate their targets in near total darkness. As night raids continued, it became increasingly clear that Germany's original air defense system would have to evolve. The war in the skies had moved into conditions that demanded entirely new tactics and technologies. While night bombing reduced the effectiveness of German daylight defenses, it also created a serious challenge for the attacking forces themselves. Navigating across long distances in darkness made it difficult for bomber crews to locate their targets accurately. Cities were large, but identifying the correct industrial districts or military facilities within them was far more complicated when crews could not clearly see the ground below. Early night raids often scattered bombs across wide areas because individual aircraft struggled to identify the exact target point. To solve this problem, the Royal Air Force introduced a specialized group of aircraft known as Pathfinder units. These crews were trained to fly ahead of the main bomber formations and identify the correct target area before the rest of the aircraft arrived. Non-Pathfinder crews used a combination of navigation techniques, radar systems, and visual observation to locate the intended bombing location, even in darkness. Once the Pathfinder aircraft reached the target area, they marked it using special flares and incendiary markers. These markers created bright visual signals on the ground that could be seen by bomber crews approaching behind them. Instead of searching for the target themselves, the main bomber force could simply aim for the illuminated markers placed by the Pathfinders. This system dramatically improved the coordination of night bombing raids. Rather than individual aircraft dropping bombs based on uncertain navigation, large formations of bombers could concentrate their attacks around clearly marked target points. Then the Pathfinder units effectively guided the rest of the bomber force toward the intended location. The use of Pathfinder aircraft also increased the scale of night bombing operations. Once targets could be marked more reliably, Bomber Command could send hundreds of aircraft toward the same objective in a single raid. These large formations created a much greater concentration of bombs within a smaller area, increasing the destructive impact of the attack. German air defenses attempted to disrupt these operations by targeting the early arriving Pathfinder aircraft whenever possible. If the Pathfinders could be intercepted before they placed their markers, the main bomber formation might struggle to locate the target accurately. However, identifying Pathfinder aircraft in darkness was difficult, and many raids succeeded in marking their targets before defenders could interfere. As the Pathfinder system became more effective, night bombing raids grew more organized and concentrated. The combination of improved navigation and target marking allowed bomber formations to deliver their payloads with far greater coordination than earlier night operations had achieved. This innovation added another layer of difficulty for German defenders attempting to protect their cities from nighttime attacks. As night bombing raids became more frequent and more organized, German air defenses were forced to develop new methods to counter the growing threat. The original defense network had focused heavily on daylight interception, but now the majority of bomber attacks were taking place under cover of darkness. To respond to this challenge, Germany began building a specialized system designed specifically for nighttime air combat. Central to this new approach was the development of night fighter units. These aircraft were equipped and trained to operate in darkness, working closely with ground-based radar stations that tracked incoming bomber formations. Instead of relying only on visual spotting, German air defense commanders began using radar to guide interceptor pilots toward the approximate location of enemy bombers flying overhead. Radar operators monitored the movement of incoming aircraft on their screens and transmitted instructions to night fighter pilots by radio. These instructions directed the fighters toward the area where bombers were expected to pass. Once the fighters approached the target zone, pilots attempted to locate the bombers visually or with onboard radar systems installed in some aircraft. Night fighter aircraft were modified to improve their ability to operate in darkness. Specialized radar equipment allowed pilots to detect nearby aircraft even when they could not see them clearly. Once a bomber was detected on the radar display, the fighter pilot could move closer until the aircraft became visible against the faint glow of city lights, fires on the ground, or the reflection of searchlights in the sky. German defenses also developed coordinated systems that linked radar stations, searchlights, and night fighters into a unified network. Radar could detect the bomber formations approaching, searchlights could attempt to illuminate the aircraft, and fighters could be directed to intercept them once their positions were known. This method aimed to create controlled interception zones, where bombers would be exposed to multiple defensive elements at once. Despite these improvements, intercepting large bomber formations at night remained extremely difficult. Hundreds of bombers might be crossing German airspace simultaneously, often at different altitudes and directions. Night fighters had to locate individual aircraft within these formations, which required precise coordination and skilled flying under very challenging conditions. Even when interceptions were successful, stopping an entire bombing raid was nearly impossible. A few bombers might be intercepted, but many others continued toward their targets. The scale of the bomber formations meant that some aircraft would always manage to pass through the defenses. Germany had developed a more advanced night defense system, but the battle in the skies was becoming increasingly complex and difficult to control. As night bombing operations intensified, the scale of the air war over Germany reached levels that few had imagined earlier in the conflict. What had begun as smaller bombing raids gradually evolved into massive formations of aircraft crossing the skies over Europe. Hundreds of bombers could now take part in a single operation, flying in long streams toward German industrial regions and major cities. These formations were organized carefully so that aircraft would arrive over the target area within a relatively short time period, overwhelming local defenses. When such large bomber groups reached their objectives, the effects were far greater than those of earlier raids. Instead of bombs being scattered across wide areas by individual aircraft searching for targets in darkness, pathfinder markers and coordinated bombing patterns allowed large numbers of aircraft to concentrate their payloads in the same general region. High explosive bombs were often dropped first to damage buildings, infrastructure, and water systems, followed by incendiary devices designed to ignite fires throughout the city. Once multiple fires began burning across a dense urban area, the situation could escalate quickly. Flames spread through buildings, debris blocked streets, and smoke rose high into the night sky. The intense heat generated by numerous fires could combine into large firestorms that drew air toward the burning zones, feeding the flames even further. These conditions made it extremely difficult for emergency services or civil defense teams to control the spreading fires. The German air defenses continued attempting to intercept incoming bombers during these raids. Anti-aircraft guns fired heavily as the aircraft approached, and night fighters attempted to locate bombers moving through the darkness. However, the sheer number of aircraft involved in these operations made it impossible to stop every bomber before it reached its target. Even if several bombers were intercepted, hundreds of others might still pass through the defensive network. The concentration of bombing raids on major cities placed enormous pressure on the German air defense system. Radar operators, searchlight crews, anti-aircraft gunners, and night fighter pilots were all engaged in continuous efforts to track and intercept the incoming formations. Despite these efforts, large sections of urban areas could still be struck during these operations. The expansion of night bombing demonstrated how dramatically the air war had changed from its early stages. Instead of isolated bombing missions carried out by smaller groups of aircraft, the conflict had evolved into massive operations involving hundreds of bombers flying under cover of darkness. German defenses had adapted in many ways, but the scale and coordination of these nighttime raids created challenges that were extremely difficult to overcome. By the later stages of the war, the shift toward nighttime bombing had fundamentally changed how the air campaign over Germany was fought. What had once been a battlefield dominated by daylight interception had evolved into a complex system of radar tracking, night fighter patrols, and large bomber formations operating under the cover of darkness. Both sides were forced to adapt continuously as technology and tactics reshaped the balance in the skies. For German defenders, the transition to night combat required an entirely different approach to air defense. Radar stations, command centers, searchlight units, and interceptor squadrons had to work together in coordinated networks designed specifically to track and intercept aircraft that could no longer be seen clearly against the sky. The night fighter units became a permanent part of the defense system, operating across large sections of airspace where bomber formations were expected to appear. Even with these adjustments, the challenge remained enormous. The scale of nighttime bombing operations meant that large numbers of aircraft could cross defended regions simultaneously. Radar operators had to monitor multiple formations moving through the airspace, while fighter pilots attempted to locate individual bombers in darkness using radar guidance or brief visual contact. Anti-aircraft batteries continued to fire against suspected bomber routes, but accurate targeting at night was always more difficult than during daylight operations. For the attacking forces, night bombing required careful coordination and specialized techniques. Pathfinder aircraft marked targets. The navigation systems guided bomber formations across long distances, and large numbers of aircraft were organized into concentrated raids designed to overwhelm defenses. The goal was not only to reach the target, but to do so in a way that reduced exposure to the defensive systems waiting below. The result was a type of aerial conflict that had little resemblance to the daylight interception battles expected during the early years of the war. Darkness changed how aircraft were detected, how interceptions occurred, and how bombing raids were organized. The skies over Europe became a battlefield where technology, coordination, and strategy played an increasingly important role. In the end, the air war over Germany demonstrated how quickly military tactics could evolve once the conditions of combat changed, and the defenses built to stop daylight bombers had to be redesigned for a conflict fought largely at night. The war in the skies had become a battle of radar, navigation, and adaptation.